Hello and welcome back to our study of A Course in Miracles. I'm Danny Spendlove, and today we are in Chapter 4, Section 5, The Ego-Body Illusion. Paragraph 1. All things work together for good. There are no exceptions except in the ego's judgment. I just want you to remember this line for later. We're going to come back to this one. The ego exerts maximal vigilance about what it permits into awareness. And this is not the way a balanced mind holds together. It kind of makes me think of confirmation bias. How when you think something is true, you tend to only let in or believe evidence that confirms what you already think is true, and you sort of tend to filter out things that go against your belief. And so sounds like the ego is the perfect example of confirmation bias. It exerts maximal vigilance about what it permits into awareness. And this is not the way a balanced mind holds together. So if you're only letting in so much information, you're definitely going to not be balanced. The ego is thrown further off balance because it keeps its primary motivation from your awareness and raises control rather than sanity to predominance. So the ego doesn't really care about sanity. It just wants control. And I think whenever we are very anxious about things and we feel like we need to control things because that's the only way we can be safe, that is a very ego kind of tendency, needing to control things to the point where we're sacrificing our sanity. The ego has every reason to do this, according to the thought system which gave rise to it and which it serves. And if you recall, the thought system that gave rise to the ego was believing that we are A, separated from God, and B, that we can create ourselves, that we can somehow change what God has created and make ourselves into something different. So, because of that thought system, sane judgment would inevitably judge against the ego and must be obliterated by the ego in the interest of its self-preservation. So the ego realizes that if you could judge sanely, you would judge against it. So it must protect you from sane judgment in order to preserve itself. Paragraph 2. A major source of the ego's off-balanced state is its lack of discrimination between the body and the thoughts of God. Thoughts is capitalized. So thoughts of God, thoughts and God are capitalized. God is always capitalized because that's a proper noun. So I'm assuming that you know every time I say God, God is capitalized. But here, the whole phrase, thoughts of God, is capitalized. Thoughts of God are unacceptable to the ego because they clearly point to the non-existence of the ego itself. The ego therefore either distorts them or refuses to accept them. It cannot, however, make them cease to be. It therefore tries to conceal not only unacceptable, and that's in quotes, unacceptable body impulses, but also the thoughts of God, because both are threatening to it. Okay, so let's back up just a little bit. So the very beginning of the paragraph 2, a major source of the ego's off-balance state is its lack of discrimination between the body and the thoughts of God. So it sees the body and thoughts of God as the same. There's a lack of discrimination between the two. Thoughts of God are unacceptable to the ego because they clearly point to the non-existence of the ego itself. The ego therefore either distorts them, so distorts the thoughts of God, or refuses to accept them, so just straight out denial. It cannot, however, make them cease to be. It therefore tries to conceal not only unacceptable body impulses, which again, it treats those the same as being a thought of God. So unacceptable body impulses, but also the thoughts of God, because both are threatening to it. Being concerned primarily with its own preservation in the face of threat, the ego perceives them as the same. By perceiving them as the same, the ego attempts to save itself from being swept away as it would surely be in the presence of knowledge. And to be honest, I'm not sure what the threat is from unacceptable body impulses. I don't know if it's maybe referring to any weakness in the body. It's going to go over that in a little bit. So maybe when we get to that part, we'll come back to this and see if connections start to be made. As often happens when I'm making these videos, I'll study the section and, have some thoughts and, some things that come to my mind. And then as I start talking to this camera, all of a sudden other connections come to my mind that did not occur to me when I read it originally. So I'm kind of curious to see if anything like that comes up, because I'm not quite sure why the ego is lumping thoughts of God with the body, with these unacceptable body impulses, why it's seeing those as the same. Paragraph 3 says, any thought system that confuses God and the body must be insane. Which is kind of my confusion. Like, why are these unacceptable body impulses being compared or confused with the thoughts of God? And of course, in Miracles agrees with me. Like, it's insane to think that the body and God are the same thing. Yet this confusion is essential to the ego, which judges only in terms of threat or non-threat to itself. In one sense, the ego's fear of God is at least logical, since the idea of him does dispel the ego. But fear of the body, with which the ego identifies so closely, makes no sense at all. And I agree, because I just don't get it at this point. Paragraph 4. The body is the ego's home by its own election. It is the only identification with which the ego feels safe, since the body's vulnerability is its own best argument that you cannot be of God. So the fact that your body is so vulnerable and weak, your ego is able to say, haha, see, there's no way you could be of God. Look how weak and pathetic you are. This is the belief that the ego sponsors eagerly. Yet the ego hates the body because it cannot accept it as good enough to be its home. Here's where the mind becomes actually dazed. Being told by the ego that it is really part of the body and that the body is its protector, the mind is also told that the body cannot protect it. Therefore, the mind asks, where can I go for protection? To which the ego replies, turn to me. The mind, and not without cause, reminds the ego that it has itself insisted that it is identified with the body, so there's no point in turning to it for protection. The ego has no real answer to this because there is none. But it does have a typical solution. It obliterates the question from the mind's awareness. Once out of awareness, the question can and does produce uneasiness, but it cannot be answered because it cannot be asked. So this is a fascinating conundrum, right? So the ego identifies with the body because the body is vulnerable and weak, and the ego's like, yay, this proves that you're not of God. So your mind goes, okay, well, we'll turn to the body for protection, but oh no, it's too weak and it can't protect you. So then the mind says, well, where should we turn for protection? And the ego says, well, I will protect you. And then your mind goes, but you said you're the body. So if the body can't protect me, then you can't protect me. And the ego has no good answer for that. So then the ego just obliterates the question. We're not allowed to ask that question anymore. And so we feel a sense of uneasiness, and again, like this sense of lack, and like we're not quite safe, but we don't actually approach that subject because the ego tries to make us avoid it because it has no good answer for us. Interesting, right? Paragraph 5. This is the question that must be asked. Where can I go for protection? Seek and ye shall find does not mean that you should seek blindly and desperately for something you would not recognize. Meaningful seeking is consciously undertaken, consciously organized, and consciously directed. thought that was interesting that it focused on conscious, because our conscious mind is quite limited, I feel like. I mean, not, I don't know that it's ever necessarily said that in A Course in Miracles, but we're very much influenced by our egos when we're conscious. Maybe even when we're unconscious, I'm not sure. But meaningful seeking is consciously undertaken, consciously organized, and consciously directed. And I know in the spiritual experiences I have had, I have felt impressed that my intentions are very powerful. And intentions are definitely something that you consciously make. The whole point of an intention is intent. You intend. Um, and so I've just felt very impressed recently in my life that my intentions are important, and I need to be clear about my intentions and focus on those intentions, and that my intentions will guide me in ways that I don't fully understand. And so, seek and ye shall find does not mean that you should seek blindly and desperately for something you would not recognize. Meaningful seeking is consciously undertaken, consciously organized, and consciously directed. And I kind of wonder if that's referring to intentions. The goal must be formulated clearly and kept in mind. Learning and wanting to learn are inseparable. You learn best when you believe what you are trying to learn is of value to you. However, not everything you may want to learn has lasting value. So there are some things you may want to learn, but they don't actually, and they have value to you, but they don't have lasting value. Indeed, many of the things you want to learn may be chosen because their value will not last. That's an interesting thought. Paragraph 6. The ego thinks it is an advantage not to commit itself to anything that is eternal, because the eternal must come from God. Eternalness is the one function the ego has tried to develop but has systematically failed to achieve. The ego compromises with the issue of the eternal, just as it does with all issues touching on the real question in any way, by becoming involved with tangential issues. I hope I said that word right. Tangential issues, basically tangents. It hopes to hide the real question and keep it out of mind. So our ego is really good at distracting us with things that aren't actually important, and especially things that have nothing to do with eternity. Like, let's stay as focused on, what would be some good examples? On the stock market. Let's stay really focused on all the beefs we have with the other political parties that we just hate. Or let's stay focused on, anything that is temporary and has nothing to do with eternity. Let's get really focused on those things and really obsessed over those things, because anything that's eternal comes from God. And anything that is of God is going to weaken our belief in the ego. So, interesting, huh? The ego's characteristic busyness with non essentials is for precisely that purpose. Preoccupations with problems set up to be incapable of solution are favorite ego devices for impeding learning progress. So, coming up with problems that can't actually be solved. What an amazing waste of time! And that is one of the ego's favorites, is getting you all wound up in problems that can't be solved. And I think this can go in either direction. It can go in the direction of like the very worldly, and things that have very little to do with spirituality. And I think it can get into the spiritual, where we're going all deep and having all of these really deep conversations about things that we can't know the answer to yet. Like in this life, it's actually not that important. It prevents us from staying present and grounded and staying connected to the spirit and being guided. We get all like wrapped up in these really deep issues and these philosophical wonderings and just waste a lot of time on things that aren't important and probably not even true. And so, you're just philosophizing about the possibility that they might be true. you know, and not that I think it's bad to ponder on things and to have those deep conversations and kind of stretch our minds and talking about those things, but I just wonder if sometimes the ego likes to get us a little too involved in those things. In these diversionary tactics, however, the one question that is never asked by those who pursue them is, what for? This is the question that you must learn to ask in connection with everything. What is the purpose? Whatever it is, it will direct your efforts automatically. When you make a decision of purpose or intention, right? Then you have made a decision about your future effort, a decision that will remain in effect unless you change your mind. So I have an example. I think this is an example of what this is talking about. This actually just happened like a week and a half ago. So it was really interesting when I read this section. I was like, oh, huh, what a coincidence. So I was having a conversation with some family, and I had mentioned that I have this belief that everything works out for our highest good. I really believe that, which is why it was so interesting that the very first line of this section says, all things work together for good. There are no exceptions except in the ego's judgment. So it's interesting because, anyway, we were just having a conversation about that exactly. And not everyone agreed with me. Not everyone agreed that everything that happens is ultimately for the highest good. And I can see why, there's like really horrific things happen, and I can see why people would say there's no way that any good came from that. But I choose to believe that all things happen for the highest good in some way, and we may not always see what that is. And I was explaining to someone else later, I was sharing with them this conversation I had had with others. And I was explaining that the reason why I choose to believe this, because I might be wrong, right? And this was even before I read this in A Course in Miracles today. And, I had forgotten about this particular section and that particular line. But apparently it stuck with me. And there are other things that have happened to me in my life that have just made me feel like that's the case. But I was telling this other person, the reason why I choose to believe this is because it helps me not feel like a victim. Otherwise, it's so easy when hard things happen to go into that victim mentality and to feel so disempowered. And this belief I have that everything works out for the highest good helps me even in like the silliest small things. So it helps me in big things for sure to look for the good. When something bad happens, when something hard happens to me, I naturally start scanning for the good. Like, what is the lesson in this? How is this making me stronger? How does this make me a better person? And even in like the silly little everyday things, like I am hitting every single red light and I was already going to be a little bit late. Now I'm going to be really late. Things like that. I have trained myself to have this little voice come on in my head that says, I guess I was supposed to be late. For some reason, there's some good reason for me not to get there at the time that I had hoped to get there, or just like little things like that. And it just helps me to not have so much stress and to just kind of surrender and let things go instead of, me being super tense and anxious and upset sitting at a stoplight. There's literally nothing I can do. to make the light change any faster. So telling myself, well, I guess I'll get there when I'm meant to get there, and for whatever reason, it's for the best that I get there later than I had expected. It helps me. And so that's what for. Why do we believe the things we believe? I believe that everything happens for the highest good because then I don't feel like a victim. Then I feel empowered. Then I feel less stressed about my life. And I'm always looking for the positive and how I can grow from things instead of like, woe is me. And not that you can't have the woe is me moments. I've definitely had times in my life where I was like, oh, that was hard. And I mourn and I grieve and I go through all those phases. And in the end, I look for how I'm a better, stronger person because of it. So, why do you believe the things you believe? What for? What's the purpose? Why are you holding that grudge? What is the purpose? How is it serving you? And it is, because you wouldn't do it if it wasn't serving you. So then just looking and saying, is that actually what I value? Do I value retribution? Do I value judgment and justice? And maybe you do. Then you're aligned with your values, and that's great for you. And so, but I think sometimes we are believing things that actually go against our values and are actually derailing our intentions. And we just haven't been clear enough about our intentions. And so seeking is consciously undertaken, consciously organized, and consciously directed. What are you seeking? And then make sure that that answer, what for, aligns with those conscious intentions. So, anyway, that is all for this particular section. I hope that you enjoyed it and it gave me food for thought. Hopefully, it'll give you food for thought. And please put in the comments maybe some of the reasons why you believe some of the things you believe, or any other interpretations or aha moments you had from this section. And I look forward to seeing you next time.